Hello and welcome to the Tufts Graduate School of Arts and Sciences Graduate Student Speaker Series, or GS3. This is our first speaker for the fall GS3, and it is my pleasure to introduce Katja Kwaku from the Department of Biology. Katja will give her presentation and will allow a few minutes at the end for questions. Katja, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Katja, and I'll be talking about leaf transfer and the leafcutter ant at Cephalotes. So this is a project I did last year as part of the course Bio 181, which is Tropical Ecology and Conservation. And this was in collaboration with my classmates, Elena, Maria, and Isaac. So there are actually 47 different species of leafcutter ants like this one here, and they can be found all across the neotropics. They are social insects, so they're found in colonies, and leafcutter ant colonies are based in the underground nest that they have. But of course, they have to leave the nest to forage and where they go climb up trees and use their mandibles to cut leaf fragments. And they cut the leaf fragments and bring them back down the tree and back into the nest. And here's a photo of a typical leafcutter ant trail where all the little ants are bringing the leaf fragments back to the nest. And back at the nest is where they have their fungus garden. So leafcutter ants have this super cool symbiotic mutualistic relationship with the fungus, and it's the whole reason why they cut and carry leaf fragments. It's because they give the leaves to the fungus, which helps the fungus grow. And then in return, the fungus acts as a food source for the leafcutter ant larvae. And there are a few different ways to get these really important leaf fragments from the tree to the nest. The most common and most simple way is for an ant to cut a leaf fragment and then carry it back to the nest, just like that. Alternatively, an ant could cut a leaf and then hand it over to a second ant that would then go bring it back to the nest. And this is called direct transfer. And then there's a third thing that could happen where an ant cuts a leaf fragment, drops it on the ground, and then a second ant will come by later to pick it up and bring it back to the nest. And this is called indirect transfer. And when the rate of dropping leaves exceeds the rate of picking up leaves, then you'll find these caches or piles of leaves by the trails. This is a sign of indirect transfer. And both direct and indirect transfer are types of leaf transfer, which is the topic I'm talking about today. So a lot of different things will affect leaf transfer frequency, or how often ants transfer their leaves. Basically, they'll do it whenever it increases the rate of leaf transport back to the nest. Whenever it increases the colony efficiency, then they'll transfer their leaves. And this could depend on ant size, for example. So in some species, the big ants with big mandibles, they do the cutting, and then they hand off the leaf fragment to the smaller ants, and the smaller ants do the carrying. In other species, it's the exact opposite, where the small ants actually do the cutting, and then they hand it off over to the big ants that do the carrying, because the big ants have longer legs and they're much faster. They can get the fragment there more quickly. Another factor affecting leaf transfer frequency is if there are obstacles on the trail. So like in this example, here's a leafcutter ant trail, and there's a big leaf right in the middle of the trail. This isn't a super bad obstacle, but it could be something like a fallen branch right in the middle of the trail. And whenever something like this happens, the ants are much more likely to transfer their leaves at the site of the obstacle. That way it's just easier to get the leaf fragment across the obstacle. Another factor is crowding. Like in this top photo, this leafcutter ant trail is super crowded. There are lots of ants and lots of leaves happening. And in that situation, it's more efficient for ants to transfer their leaves more often, as opposed to here when the leafcutter ant trail is not crowded and it's just easier for the ants to carry the leaves themselves. A really important factor that affects leaf transfer frequency is the length of the trail, or how far you are, the distance from the nest. And the study by Michele et al. In 2015 did a great job of showing this pattern. So each of these 4 graphs represents a different species of leafcutter ant. And on the x-axis, going from left to right, we go from long to short trails. And then you can see how often they transfer the leaves, which are the black bars, like the number of leaf fragments that get transferred are the black bars, and then the number of leaf fragments that are not transferred are the white bars. And there are some differences among the 4 species, but the same general trend applies to all of them, which is as you decrease the trail length, you also decrease the number of fragments that get transferred. And the reasoning behind this has to do with how ants know they're on a foraging trail. Ants know that they're on a foraging trail because of the presence of trail pheromone, or a chemical signal that's deposited when a bunch of ants are using the pathway. And leaf transfer gives ants the opportunity to deposit this trail pheromone, and this helps so that they don't get lost. So let's say you're an ant on a super long trail, you're really far away from the nest. If you transfer, you have the opportunity to deposit this trail pheromone, and that way you won't get lost even if you're really far away from the nest. Another important factor affecting leaf transfer frequency is trail novelty. So in this diagram here, the black line at the top represents the main trail, which is well established and there are lots of ants going along it. And then the authors here, Hubble et al., put in some new leaves right where this black dot is. So some of the ants left the main trail and formed these new trails to the newly discovered food source. And the authors found that the ants were much more likely to transfer, either directly or indirectly, at these X's here, so at these trail junctions. These junctions are the intersection between the main and established trail. And the reasoning behind this pattern is also due to pheromones. So say you're an ant coming from this new food source. If you transfer here instead of continuing on to the main, to the nest, that gives you the opportunity to return to the newly discovered food source quickly enough before this new pheromone scent attenuates. And so if you get here quickly enough, then you have the opportunity to deposit trail pheromone so that the trail becomes more established over time. This trail will be condensed and less tortuous, and the ants won't get lost. So I've just talked about a lot of factors that can affect leaf transfer frequency, but we noticed that all of these studies have to do with ants traveling along horizontal paths, like just on the ground. And we thought this was a problem because a huge part of leaf cutter ant foraging behavior is that they climb up and down trees. So we were wondering if leaf transfer frequency depends on whether or not the ant is on the vertical trunk of the tree or the horizontal ground, or maybe the base of the tree, which is the intersection between the two. And we thought that the ants would transfer more often while on the trunk of the tree because walking down a tree with a leaf is energetically costly. The leaf exerts torque on the ant and makes the ant more susceptible to just toppling over because of that extra weight of the leaf. So if ants were to transfer while on the trunk, either directly or indirectly, which would be just dropping the leaf from the trunk to the ground, that would minimize this cost because then you would never have a single ant traversing the entire tree with a leaf. We also thought that the ants might transfer more at the base of the tree here because they might view the base of the tree like a trail junction, similar to the junction between novel and established paths that I just talked about. So at the end of December, we were able to go down to Costa Rica to test these ideas. Here's a photo of me and Elena with a leafcutter ant trail. After we had observed them for a bit, we just watched one species of leafcutter ant, Atacephalotes. It's the most abundant one that there was there. And we conducted an observational study where we designated 3 sections along the trail: the trunk, the base, and the ground. And we decided that the base would start at this angle between the main trunk and where the roots started off, and that the base would end at the end of this main leaf cache here. We noticed that most of the trees had a pretty obvious leaf cache at the bottom of the tree, which was cool because that way we knew that there was some indirect transfer going on. And then the trunk and the base were measured as 1.5 meters from either side of the base. So with these 3 trail sections, we recorded the number of direct transfers, and then for the number of indirect transfers, we recorded the number of dropped leaves and the number of picked up leaves. And we observed the ants, or each section, for 20 minutes. And we randomized the order of observed trail sections, just in case there was a confounding variable of us becoming fatigued and missing some transfer events, since we were watching the ants for an hour at a time. And then to analyze our results, we used a general linear model with the trail section as the parameter evaluated, and we did an analysis of variance, or ANOVA, on the model to see if there were significant differences between transfer frequencies among trail sections. And we were able to do this procedure for 10 Atacephalotes colonies in total, and 8 of them had leaf caches at the bottom. Here's a better view of a leaf cache. And then the 2 that didn't have a leaf cache, we decided that the base would end about 0.2 meters away from the end of the roots, so that the bases were all roughly the same length. And all of the colonies displayed leaf transfer of some sort, which was really exciting to us because that was the whole topic of our project that we'd worked so hard on preparing for over the course of the semester. So continuing with our results, this graph shows the number of direct transfer events over the 20 minutes for our 3 trail sections: the trunk, the base, and the ground. And this graph shows that the trail section actually did not have any significant effect on the direct transfer frequency. The median was around like 4 transfer events for all 3 sections, although we had some outliers, like this was a really overachieving colony and they transferred 35 times on the trunk in 20 minutes. So that was a fun observation period. And then I'm going to move on to our indirect transfer results, which are pretty interesting. So remember, for indirect transfer, we had 2 measures: the number of leaves dropped and the number of leaves picked up. And we analyzed these separately so that we didn't double count a single indirect transfer event. So looking at the graph on the left first is the number of leaves dropped for our 3 sections. And contrary to our predictions, we found that the ants dropped leaves significantly less often, in fact, almost never, at the trunk as opposed to on the base and the ground. So we thought that ants would prefer to drop their leaves on the trunk, from the trunk to the ground, to minimize the cost of climbing down the tree. But in this case, they seemed like they didn't want to do that. There are a few explanations for this. One of them could be that just in the context of this study, the cost of climbing down the tree was not that bad compared to the risk of losing a leaf fragment if you just drop it from the trunk to the ground. And then for leaves dropped, the the base had more transfers than the ground, but this result was not significant. And then moving on to the right side of the graph is the number of leaves picked up. And here we don't have the trunk because you can't really pick up leaves from the trunk because the trunk is vertical. So we just have these, the base and the ground. And when indirect transfer was measured like this, as the number of leaves picked up, we found that the base, that they were much more likely to transfer more often at the base of the tree than the ground. This was a significant difference. And this difference is especially noteworthy because the base, all of the bases that we measured were shorter in length than the 1.5 meters of the ground. So it's pretty impressive that the ants were able to pick up so many more leaves in a shorter length. So those are the main results. And from our results, here are some main takeaways. Although there weren't any significant differences for direct transfer, for indirect transfer frequency, trail section matters. It seems like they have a preference for transferring indirectly at the base, especially when we measured it as picking up instead of dropping. And it seems like they don't drop leaves from the trunk very often, almost never. And these results mean that the ants may view the base of the tree as a trail junction, just like the trail junction between novel and established trails I talked about earlier. And our results also mean that the leaf caches we saw at the bottoms of the trees are due to indirect transfer at the base and not on the trunk. And this is in contrast with a few previous studies that observed a much higher frequency of dropping leaves from the trunk to the ground, which we did not see. And then also, even though we didn't find any significant differences with direct transfer, we did see direct transfer on the trunk at 8 out of our 10 colonies that we surveyed. So we know that direct transfer on the trunk exists, which was pretty exciting to us since to our knowledge, this has not been explicitly discussed before. We were really nervous that the ants would just not transfer on the trunk at all, since we hadn't read anything about it in the literature when we were planning and preparing for this project. So that was exciting. And then finally, I just wanted to go over some possible mechanisms that could be responsible for this apparent preference for transferring at the base. That could explain why the ants seem to view the base of the tree as a trail junction. So first, they could think it's a junction because they're detecting a change in plane, just going from vertical to horizontal from the trunk to the ground. This is plausible because previous studies have shown that ants can distinguish, they can detect changes in trail slope or gradient. But they could also be detecting the change in texture, so going from the bark of the tree to the soil on the ground. This is also plausible because previous studies have shown that ants can probably detect changes in texture just like this. And then there's also some evidence that the pheromone concentration is higher on the trunk than on the ground, so they could be detecting a change in pheromone concentration. If we remember our graph from, or our figure from Hubble et al., where the ants transferred at the junctions where the X's are, and the ants were going from low pheromone concentration because it's a novel trail to high pheromone concentration because it's an established trail. And the authors actually found out that just putting trail pheromone in front of the ant can induce them to transfer directly or drop their leaves. So we know that an increase in pheromone concentration can cause ants to transfer their leaves, but we don't know if any change in pheromone concentration, like this decrease going from the trunk to the ground, could cause it, but it is a possibility. So if we were to ever go back to Costa Rica and do this again, it would be great to do a controlled manipulative study with artificial trails With artificial trails, we could control for a lot of the confounding variables I talked about earlier, like obstacles in the trail or the width of the trail, which would influence the crowding. And a manipulative study would help us distinguish between these three possible mechanisms, which in turn would give us more insight into what drives decision-making in these social insects. So with that, I would like to thank my collaborators, Elena, Maria, and Isaac. This project was a product of some excellent teamwork among the four of us. Also, thank you to our Bio 181 professor, Colin Oriens, and our other field instructors, Sarah Lewis, Rachel Benowen, and Nick Dorian. And finally, this trip was funded by the Wendy and Neil Sandler International Research Program. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I have a question if I'm allowed. Am I allowed?
Okay.
Yes. Yes, please.
I can go back to a slide if you want.
Well, I have a couple, but I'll start with one, and that is that you got me all excited about thinking that that these transfers, the transferring behavior had something to do with possibly protecting the pheromone trail. That is, if there's pheromones, if an ant has figured out a new food source, then the pheromone trail by one ant is going to be very, very dilute. And so there's only one ant that really knows that knows where it is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
fewer ants know where the new material is than know where the main trail is. And so one could say, well, the pheromones are a way to establish a main trail or to maintain the main trail's priority. But I would argue that on a trunk of a tree, you don't need a pheromone to tell you where to go because there's only one place you can go. The trees that you show, they're not very wide. It's not like they're going to take a wrong turn someplace. They're always going to go up. They're always going to find leaves. So I don't know why they'd be dumping pheromones on those trunks. My hypothesis would have been they don't need a pheromone on the trunk. I would expect that the pheromones on the trunks would be less concentrated than the pheromones on the trail on the ground, because the trail on the ground, they could go all sorts of places since they need guidance, but you don't need guidance on the trunk. And yet, so you did find that there were a lot of pheromones on the tree, but still it was higher on the ground, correct?
And like we couldn't measure the pheromones,
right,
but the transfer was
transfer.
There was transfer on the trunk, but not as much as on the base or the ground.
Right. Okay. So do you think that there's a principle that where there are more transfers, there are more transfers where the pheromone trail, the pheromone concentration is highest? Isn't that?
Right. So the study I talked about very briefly at the end showed that there was higher pheromone concentration on the trunk of the tree versus the ground.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but I think it has to do with the texture of the tree, and apparently the pheromone evaporates more slowly on the tree than in the soil. So yeah, and then the transferring gives them the opportunity to deposit the pheromone, but it's also beneficial if it increases the rate of leaf transport to the nest. So that's why we were thinking that they might transfer more on the trunk because it would minimize the cost of going down the tree and probably speed up the process of leaf transport.
So is pheromone just released wherever they are, or do they intentionally release pheromone?
They intentionally release them. They put like their gasters to the ground, and it's something they can do just normally or when they are transferring, but I don't think they can do it while they're carrying a leaf. So if they're transferring a leaf, then it gives them the opportunity to do it.
Fascinating. Excellent. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Katja, you mentioned that there's a cost potentially to carrying a leaf down the tree, and so that's one reason why they might drop it, but you didn't find that.
Right.
Is one explanation that the cost of dropping it and having a leaf become contaminated? Like, do ants pick up leaves that are dropped, or once it's dropped and on the ground? I feel like if they're farming fungus, you don't really want contamination from the ground on your leaf. I feel like you might be introducing new things. Do you did you see ants picking up leaves that were dropped, or was most transfer direct transfer? Like, was it indirect or direct?
Mostly direct. I mean, indirect. Sorry.
So mostly indirect. So mostly
Yeah.
picking leaves up off the ground.
Yeah, and we did see sometimes an ant would drop a leaf and then we would see an ant pick up the same leaf and go, which is why we analyzed the dropped and picked up separately because we didn't want to count that one fragment twice. So yeah, we definitely saw lots of ants picking up leaves from the cache and also just along the trail. But yeah, I hadn't thought about contamination from falling to the
Do you
ground.
know if they do any sort of sorting when they get back to the nest? Like, do they sort contaminated leaves? I imagine it's kind of not efficient to sort leaves on the trail and maybe just discard them when other ants find that they're contaminated. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they do some sort of sorting either at the nest entrance or within the nest, because there are also sometimes caches of leaves at the nest entrance.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, sometimes the ants pick up the leaves and bring them back in, so it's like a leaf cache. But I think other studies have shown that they could be just discarded leaves that they don't want.
Thanks.
So do the ants only farm a particular kind of leaf?
No, they cut many different types of leaves. Yeah, I was always taught that they're not picky and that they will cut any leaf as long as it's physically soft enough for them to cut it and that there's no like huge chemical defense. But then when we got to Costa Rica, we actually had trouble finding, because originally we wanted to do a more manipulative study and we had trouble finding leaves that the ants would cut. So it seems like they have preferences of which leaves, but that they can cut a variety of leaves.
And then there's this unconnected with what you did, but it's something you said I was curious about. You said there are 47 different species of leafcutter ants, or it was a large number. And so how many times has this independently evolved?
Oh, the like leaf transfer? How many times?
Well, or just farming leaves in ant colonies in general, right? It seems, I don't know. I don't know what I thought until you said it, but I always assumed there were not very many kinds, and there was this one maybe special kind that was doing this unique thing. But if there are 47 of them across the neotropics, it sounds like it might have independently evolved several times.
Yeah, I'm not sure. There are 2 genera of leafcutter ant species, but I'm not.
Okay, interesting.
Yes.
I'll try another one. Just out of curiosity, on the Hubble paper, Hubble or Hubble, there were 2 trails. One of them was a dotted trail that went way off to the right someplace.
Yeah, I think they were just 2 different trails, ants that had left the trail and started to find the leaves. There were just 2 of them.
So it wasn't an experimental manipulation that they were trying to get the ants to decide between two circuitous trails or anything like that.
No.
Okay.
I was impressed by the one picture of the ant superhighway. Is there a lot of maintenance that goes on these? Because there were some that, like, there wasn't a leaf within like 3 inches of the path, it seemed, in one of your pictures, as if there had been lots of trail maintenance.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of trail maintenance. They do a lot of clearing of obstacles and like really making sure that there's a well-defined path. So, yeah.
Are there any additional questions?
Oh, I have one more.
Okay.
So how far, if you drop a leaf from, and I don't know how high they up are in the tree, but if you drop a cut leaf, how far might it flutter away from the base or stay on the base, right? The closer you are to the bottom, more apt it's going to be at the cache at the bottom for somebody to find. If you launch it from 10 feet up, maybe it goes some other place where no one can find it.
Yeah, so a few studies have shown that in general, about 50% of the leaf fragments are recovered. So like half of them get lost and flutter somewhere, but the other half make it to the bottom in the leaf cache. I'm not sure how tall these trees were and if they were being dropped from the very top or not. But yeah, I think 2 or 3 studies showed that, and it was like 49% or 53%.
Thank you.
I have a question. I'm sorry if you said this earlier, but I guess, what proportion of the entire trail that you were looking at was vertical versus horizontal? And do you think your results would differ if the entire trail was maybe 10% vertical and 90% horizontal? You might, like, are you seeing transfers at the midway point, or are you seeing transfers at the base because it's the base and not that it's sort of equal distance?
That's a good question. We didn't measure like exactly where within the base they were transferring, so I'm not sure if it was always right at the midway point or not. But the trunk and the ground were both 1.5 meters, and then the base was in between.
Mm-hmm. You know what the context of that 3-meter section was in the context of that, in the context of the entire trail? Like, do you know where the nest was and where the top of the tree was and how far away that? Okay.
Yeah, we didn't like always know where the colony was, where the nest was. So that's why we'd want to do a more manipulative experiment so we could control for the entire length of the trail, since obviously that has an effect on how often they transfer.
So, botanical question here. You've got 47 species of these ants running around the jungles doing this, but they'd have to be, I would think they'd be restricted to forests that had leaves all the time. So forests that did not have a cold season nor a dry season, when leaf availability would drop precipitously. Is there a sense of how many habitats, how many kinds of forests these leaf cutters are found in?
I'm not sure. I know they're limited to tropical and subtropical areas, so that way there is usually still leaves around, because even if there's a dry season, they're able to forage on many different species of leaves. But I'm not sure exactly how many specific types of habitats they're in.
Well, we're just about at time, so this is very interesting, Katja. We will make this video available, so if you'd like to share this with any of your other colleagues and family and friends, we'll be sure to get that to you. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Angela.